As we've seen, the angiosperms, the flowering and fruiting plants, these are the most diverse of the land plant groups. They're also the ones you're probably most familiar with and maybe more interested in learning about. Lots of diversity in their flowers, and that means a lot of diversity in their interactions with animal pollinators and so on. Lots of interesting things to study in this group. So angiosperms, we've kind of gone over this reproductive cycle. So male parts, female parts, the stamens contain pollen. Pollen is the male component containing sperm. And the female component, the ovule, contains egg nuclei. And then we have egg meets sperm, same as in other organisms. And that results in the seed. So these are seed plants, same as the gymnosperms, but also having this flower structure, and then more importantly, maybe the angiosperm feature of having enclosed ovules, so inside of the ovary of the flower. So this is the phylogeny of the flowering plants. Some of the major groups are highlighted on here. We're not really going to deal with a lot of these groups, the rosids and asterids, really just big categories that are sometimes used to anchor people when they're talking about these diversity of groups. On here are orders, so the ALES ending is an order ending, and you can see the ages of these orders go back around 100 million years ago. Lots of diversification over a rather short period of time in the Cretaceous. On this diagram is most of the diversification of the flowering plant orders, and compared against the relatively little diversity in the gymnosperms, happening over a longer period of time. So I have this term on here, stem age and crown age. I wanted to mention that as we talk about the age of the angiosperms. How old are flowering plants? Well, that's maybe a tougher question to answer than you might think. Number one, there's a lot of uncertainty about the ages that are on here. So these continue to get updated, they're debated, people have different opinions on these. They're anchored by what we know about fossils, and fossils only tell us that something existed, not really for how long that kind of organism existed. But anyway, if we take even just this tree, we can see there's a range of dates on here along this branch. So I want to highlight this branch for a second. And this is a branch that originates at 325 million years ago in the Carboniferous period, and goes all the way up to the early Cretaceous 139 million years ago. And so this is the branch leading to angiosperms. So you can interpret this basically, the beginning of this branch is the point at which an ancestor existed that was going to become a flowering plant. That is the earliest shared ancestor of flowering plants. Now, along this route were a bunch of extinct organisms, some we know about, some we don't really know about. But they were sort of trying out flowers and fruits along this time, interactions with animal pollinators. A lot of them have gone extinct, so they would have branched off along the way, maybe over a little more gradual time. But basically, the first thing on here, this would not have immediately been an angiosperm, a flowering plant, fruiting plant as we recognize it today. This would simply have been the branching off point where one of these seed plants was on its way to becoming a flowering plant. Now, the point where it's diversified, this is what we call the crown age. So crown as in sort of the branching out part of a tree is the crown. So the crown age is here where the diversification really happens. At that point, you really can't argue that these were anything but flowering plants. So we're leading off to various lineages of existing extant flowering plants today. They all have flowers, they all have fruits. So this ancestor at this point definitely had flowers and fruits, but way back here, the so-called stem age, not necessarily having flowers or fruits and probably not having those features. And as far as when those features arose, that's kind of up to fossils because we don't have any intermediate forms that survived until today. I mentioned some of the big groups on here. The major groups I want to differentiate here are the monocots and the eudicots. And the eudicots is a little bit tricky. The name, this cot part of the name, is short for, sorry about that, cot, monocot. Oops. Mono, and eudicot. Eudicot is basically built out of dicot, which you might have already heard about in another context. Those both refer to feature of cot, and cot is an abbreviation for cotyledon. And I like to describe these as seedling leaves or seed leaves. These are leaves that are present in the embryo. So whip back to the images here. This is a dicot embryo. The red part is going to become the plant. And it's got two of these. These are two leaves that exist inside of the seed. So even in the embryo stage, it's already made some leaves. And this being a dicot has two of them. And this one over here, this corn zea seed has one. It's basically this structure here or something like this structure, one cotyledon present inside of the seed. And this is a good way to differentiate these plants. They're it's a simple differentiator and one you can basically group everything into. If you look at the seeds as they germinate, you might have this experience from your garden. If you plant a seed, if you plant a monocot, if you're growing corn or if you're sowing grass seed, then you get one little spiky leaf coming up as the first start of that plant. If you have a dicot, it's growing tomatoes or squash or something like that, lots of your garden plants are going to be dicots. They come out with these two seedling leaves. This is the first leaves that come out as this thing is germinating. So 1 versus 2. Now we have this problem of eudicot and dicot. So it turns out that monocots are monophyletic. And we can show that on the phylogeny. And eudicots are monophyletic. So maybe you see where I'm going with this. Dicots are not monophyletic. So you would say that not all dicots are eudicots. So if we go back to our phylogeny, dicots, this two seedling leaves, is kind of an ancestral condition. These so-called basal angiosperms, these would have had two cotyledons. But if you draw a boundary around all the dicots, you don't have a single common ancestor that excludes monocots. Monocots are monophyletic. They have a single ancestor around here. And the eudicots are monophyletic. So that's where we have this term eudicot. The EU prefix means true or good or proper, or in the phylogenetic sense, like monophyletic. So we typically talk about eudicots and monocots. And then this other group, even this term basal is one that gets some people's hairs up. Basically the early branching lineages that are dicots, but they're not monophyletic with the other dicots that are the eudicots. So we're going to mostly encounter monocots and eudicots. Relative numbers, you can see this other basal angiosperm group is relatively few species, 9,000 species relative to 60,000, 180,000 in the monocots and the eudicots. Some of the bigger families are mentioned here: orchids, Orchidaceae, Poaceae is the grass family, Cyperaceae is the sedge family, and the eudicots, sunflower family, Asteraceae, bean family, Fabaceae, Rubiaceae is the coffee family. We'll see lots of families in these different groups. As far as telling the difference between them, monocots and eudicots, this differentiation is useful in the field. If you have your field guide for Wisconsin flora, you'll notice that it's broken down into a block of dicots and a block of monocots. And so being able to do this differentiation early on, this can save you some time. And that's one of the big themes of this class, is basically saving time getting to the endpoint of a correct identification. So some features shown to differentiate monocots and eudicots on here. Some of the main differentiations are shown here in leaf venation. So monocots typically more in parallel leaf venation, as shown with this palm here. Eudicots more in either pinnate or palmate venation, so venation that has more of a branching to it, midvein and branching either from the base or along the midvein. So this is more of a eudicot feature. Number of perianth parts, so typically petals in threes is more of a monocot feature. Shown here, 1, 2, 3, also stamens, typically a multiple of that as well. Eudicots more in 4s and 5s, so 5 petals on this buttercup. And for Wisconsin, at least, this is very useful. If you have a tree or a shrub, that is a eudicot. We don't have any woody monocots in Wisconsin. And technically, true wood, as people want to define it, true wood is actually absent from the monocot. So palm trees are in the monocot group, but they're more fibrous than woody. So leaf venation, perianth number, and whether they're woody or not, these features are not absolute. You can find eudicots with parallel venation. You can have monocots with branched venation, but in general, if you have a combination of these features, they're very useful for putting your plant into one of these groups. And these are, as we've seen, the main groups. Kind of an interesting departure from these patterns are in some of those early branching groups, the basal angiosperms, as I mentioned. So some of the basal angiosperms, and then I have a little asterisk down here for some of the basal eudicots, these sort of early branching groups, kind of before the patterns were fully laid down, I guess you might think. We have some dicots with multiples of 3. So perianth and multiples of 3. These are all dicots, some of them even eudicots, and they're in 3s, which is a departure from what we expect in 4s and 5s. Now, if you took these plants and you also looked at their leaf features, you might also think that you've got eudicots or dicots at least. So it's a combined pattern, as I said. Overall, there's some general trends. So the flowering plants have been evolving. There was an original flowering plant, and there's some reconstruction, some hypotheses about what the original flowering plant flower looked like. And some of that reconstruction we can do based on what some of these earliest branching flower plants, flowering groups, what their flowers look like. So some features that we see that are a little bit more basal or ancestral features are lots of perianth parts, or just lots of organs in general. So lots of petals in this water lily, lots of stamens. Farther in, you would see lots of carpels also in this flower. See parts that are separate, so there's no fusion among the petals. The stamens are all separate. Over here in this magnolia, this is a developing fruit structure. This is an aggregate of follicles that's developing, and these are individual separate carpels. They're closely pressed together, but they're developmentally, basically, they're separate. So separate carpels, separate stamens, separate petals, and then more of a spiral pattern than a whorled pattern in how those floral organs are put together. So more of a spiral here. You can trace the spiral up this fruiting structure of the magnolia. If you took the organs off of this water lily flower, you would see kind of a spiral pattern of how they're attached, and not so much a single or 1 or 2 whorls, but rather just a spiral of organs coming out a little bit more like they do on stems. So kind of makes sense that that's more of an ancestral feature. As I mentioned, there's been some effort to reconstruct the first flower. This is a paper from not too long ago that was trying to do just that, say, basically taking the evidence we have in a phylogenetic context, can we reconstruct what the original flower looked like? And not too different from what I was just describing. Separate parts, spiral arrangement, and multiples of each of the floral organs. I guess I should mention this so-called basal term here. I've been mentioning that basal is problematic, and yet I use it here on the phylogeny. Basal means like branching out from the base, but it's kind of a misleading concept because it leads you to think that these groups that are branching off closer to the base, they're basically lineages at the order level that are older. So older orders, early branching, early diverging groups, you're led to believe maybe that they have ancestral features. But to think that they still have ancestral features is to discount the fact that they've also been around for 140 million years. So even though they branched off very distant from the rest of the flowering plants, they might have taken on a lot of changes on their own over that time. So none of these looks exactly like the ancient ancestral flower. For that, we would need fossils, we would need some kind of phylogenetic reconstruction. But one of these plants that's kind of got some attention lately, we go back to the phylogeny, this branch that's sister to the rest of the flowering plants. This is Amborellales, which is an order, and it's an order that consists of a family and a species, not hardly any diversity here. And so this occupies basically the single most distant flowering plant, distantly related to all other flowering plants. So again, it's not the most ancient, but it's the most distant relative of the other flowering plants. That's an interesting plant. It's native to New Caledonia in the Pacific Ocean, far away from lots of other influence. And it's got some of these features that look kind of ancient. So it even has floral reproductive organs that look like they haven't quite finished differentiating yet. So these are stamens with broad filaments, not those skinny filaments like we're used to seeing. Separate carpels, that's consistent with what we would expect. And then also separate sexes, so female flowers, male flowers. The female flowers with some kind of rudimentary or vestigial male structures. And yeah, kind of an interesting plant, and still getting a lot of attention. As so it says the oldest angiosperm question mark. Not exactly. So the proper way to interpret that is all angiosperms are equally old. Some of them we kind of understand that they've changed less over the time since they originated, but they're all pretty old. All right, so there's a little intro to our flowering plants. We'll go over that in a lot more detail as we go.